Hey y'all. Um, Welcome to our first lecture on Alice Munro. She's, I guess, out of everybody that we're reading, my favorite living uh, author. Mostly deals with short stories. She's got one novel, but her long Nobel Prize winning career only consisted of short stories in that one novel. So she is mostly widely known for her short stories. She's from Canada. Um, she's got two collections. One is what we're looking at now, Wilderness Station, and that's selected stories from 1968 to 1994. And then I believe another one was just put out few years ago that collects her stories from 95 till to her most recent book. Of course, and those are selected stories, but you just grab any of them, any of those books off the shelf, and they'll be wonderful. She's certainly a change of pace from what we've seen so far, both in terms of theme, plot, characters, and certainly structure. Structurally speaking, these stories are very, very different. As you can see, it's a nice and it's a great change of pace. As was noted, has been noted in your wonderful discussions on the forum page, that there's a lot of overlap in the first three books, especially things they carried, and in Revolutionary Road with this idea of masculinity with several of the characters. And my intention wasn't to just bombard you with that, but to show you similar types of works and how they handled it differently. I mean, I think you could say that while Revolutionary Road and things they carried both deal with certain types of masculinity, they both do it in very different ways to very different ends. And I think it's important that there's some overlap there, but at the same time I think it's also important to put on the brakes and go sort of a different direction, while at the same time, Munro, as you'll see, there's overlap in other ways. So while these stories are predominantly from a female point of view, characters or main characters are not always, because there's a few we're going to read, kind of change that up a little bit for a couple of reasons, but usually the Munro character is a middle-aged, just below middle-aged to middle-aged to a little bit older woman, usually educated. Oftentimes the character is a writer of some sort, not always, but often. And that, of course, say there's some overlap there with her own life. Many of the stories take place in the same area in Canada, but they're all very, very rich, very, very wonderful. And I don't think there's just with Revolutionary Road, we're able to pin down the theme of conformity, or even the subject of marriage. And with the things they carried, you have loss of innocence. It was set in a war, and the Munro stories are in some ways simpler in terms of what happens, but I think they dig into the human heart. I want to say not in a better way, but certainly a different way. And maybe one thing to look for as you're reading these stories is the little metaphor or whatever I used to describe the difference between sort of the traditional linear story and how it's sort of tied into masculinity, with just the rise and the rising action, and you reach that peak and it sort of plummets. And I mentioned Alice Munro, how she described her stories oftentimes were like going into a house and just exploring. And because she does this, linear, non-linear, if you talk about a linear story and a non-linear story, you're still sort of talking about the same thing, because the non-linear story basically takes its cues from how it's sort of diverging off the track of being linear. Munro, you're dealing with something entirely different. There's no semblance of linear or non-linear. She she sort of just jumps in and goes from place to place, which means you'll get an epiphany early on in an Alice Munro story, and it'll lead to a larger epiphany later. The way she moves through time is fascinating to me. It's incredibly hard to duplicate. Whereas, I mean, you can see in the story that we read for today, I mean, it's just seamless, this incident in our narrator's past that she uses, and to some extent to foreshadow in a scary way, because I'm sure many of you, because of the obviously the illusion, the memory of the boy, Nat has followed me home, to the boy who drowned, Steve Gawley at the beginning. And then with the turkeys, that memory, I'm sure many of you thought disaster was going to happen with the little girl at the, hey Posey, get down, my dog, thought disaster was going to happen with the little girl at the pool, just because of the way she is. But anyway, you'll see her jump through time, this sort of thing. So just take notice of just how differently these stories are structured, and sort of what they're going for with their payoff. I mean, I don't know if the payoffs are ever as obvious as maybe they've been in some of the other stories, but I think that they, in some ways, they last a little bit longer, and you may be thinking about them in different ways. Many times the classic Munro epiphany is that a character comes to understand something, and in that understanding, they realize there's a lot more they don't know. And I think Miles City, Montana is a good example of that. So I hope you guys like this one. We open up with, like I said, that strong image that she has from, I don't know if you can hear, my dog is now licking my leg. So that's what the noise is. I just got done with a run. With that opening image, and like I said, it's foreboding. It connects the narrator directly to this incident. It's her father who's carrying the body of this boy who'd been drowned. Several men were together. They're carrying this body. They knew they might find something horrible. The boy's name was Steve Gawley. He was 8. His hair and clothes were mud-colored now, carried some bits of dead leaves, twigs, grass. He was like a heap of refuse that had been left out all winter. His face had turned into my father's chest, but I could see a nostril and ear plugged up with greenish mud. I don't think so. I don't think I really saw that. Perhaps as my father was carrying, I saw my father carrying the other men, but I never would have been that close. Now, surely this probably, clicked with you immediately as happening truth versus story truth, right? Something we've already talked about with the things they carry. In this case, she cuts it off before she can get carried away with it, just because that's a sort of thoughtful type of narrator that we're dealing with these Munro characters. So calling attention to the fact that even in her mind, she sort of created this memory that didn't quite exist. And, the reasons we do that, we've sort of already talked about already. Anyway, they're bringing back, so this is a great line here. To have to bring back such news, such evidence to a waiting family, particularly her mother, would have made searchers move heavily. But what was happening here was worse. Why was it worse? It seemed worse that there was no mother, and the only person, there was no woman at all. The only person there to receive Steve Gawley was his dad, who was a drinker, not a drunk, an erratic man without being entertaining, not friendly, but not exactly a troublemaker. His fatherhood seemed accidental. The fact that the child had been left to him when the mother went away, that they continued living together, seemed accidental. Just happens to be there. This is a kid who doesn't have a home life. He's not really watched after. There's certainly not a mother around. The father just sort of comes and goes. And sometimes, they didn't eat meals together. They didn't cook for each other. There was food. Sometimes he'd give some money. Sometimes the father would give Steve money to buy food at the store. And Steve was always bought really reasonable things. So the kid, sort of on his own. And this makes it worse because there's no outlet, right? We're sort of talking about that abstract sense of grief. Like there's nobody to even bring him home to, so it makes it all the worse. Then we find out the narrator knew Steve Gawley. She had liked him, had not liked him more often than she had liked. They played. He was 2 years older than her. They'd hang around Saturdays. do things. They were country kids, so they do country things. They actually played near the place where he drowned. It brings that up. There's horses. We were horses and riders both, screaming and neighing and bucking and whipping waves. Anyway, so then we go to the funeral. And here's this just wonderful memory. And it's a memory that is sort of, we sort of get in layers. And it's this, it ends with this feeling she felt as a child that she didn't understand. Or if she did understand it, she couldn't articulate it. It's only later, with what happens with the incident at the pool, that she's able to articulate quite in this way this feeling she had at this funeral. So we get this image of the funeral. It's at their house, because it's one of those things too. It's just this nice touch where you, as a kid, you don't always understand the connections going on behind the scenes with adults. I mean, you're myopic as a kid usually, so you don't necessarily see why. So it's clear to us now that seemed like because she played with the boy, that means they probably lived fairly close to the father, the mother. Her father and mother kind of took it upon themselves to do this. But anyway, so not enough room left at Steve's father's place. I have a memory of the crowded room, but no picture of Steve in his coffin, the minister, the wreaths of flowers. This is that great thing that sort of O'Brien talked about a little bit, where you kind of keep your head down a little bit. You don't get everything in these sort of intense moments, and she just remembers these glimpses. All the kids were there in a row. They sang children's hymn, which somebody played on her piano. I was wearing white ribbed stockings, which were disgustingly itchy and wrinkled at the knees and ankles. The itchy feeling of the discomfort of church clothes, or clothes that you have to wear to get dressed up, and you just don't feel comfortable. It seems like it's really like one of those memories that sticks with you as a kid. But she uses that physical image, that feeling of the stitchy stockings as a child, to connect to this bigger feeling. A feeling that was hard to describe. It had to do with my parents, adults in general, but my parents in particular. My father, who'd carried Steve's body from the river, and mother, who must have done most of the arranging of the funeral. My father in his dark blue suit, my mother in her brown velvet dress. They stood side by side, opening and closing their mouths for the hymn. I stood removed from them, in the row of children watching. I felt a furious and sickening disgust. Children sometimes have access to disgusting disgust concerning adults: the size, the lumpy shapes, bloated power, breath, coarseness, hairiness, horrible secretions. But this was more. The accompanying anger had nothing sharp and self-respecting about it. There was no release, as there would when I finally would bend and throw a stone at Steve. It could not be understood or expressed, though it died down after a while in the heaviness, and then just a taste, an occasional taste, a thin, familiar misgiving. And this story becomes, for us, a search to understand it. So she's describing this feeling. She's made very clear that when it comes to adults are strange for kids. They're in many ways, and things about them that are just strange. But like, this is something she can't pinpoint. This is sort of this abstract, blunt feeling that she never was able to release. She felt furious about it, and eventually it just sort of dissipated. It didn't dissipate, it was always there, just sort of in the back of her head. So now we're going to discover it through this other story that takes place, years and years later, 20 years later. 1961, she and her husband Andrew gets their first brand new car. We get the description, and we find out they have kids: Cynthia, 6, and Meg, 3.5. Andrew takes a picture of her standing beside the car, allusion to Jackie Kennedy, President Kennedy's wife at the time. Andrew took lots of pictures of me and the children, our house, our garden, our excursion possession. He got copies made, labeled them carefully, sent them back to his mother and his aunt and uncle in Ontario. Now, this is something else that's going to happen a lot with these Munro stories. Don't assume that every single side note or like sort of diversion in a Munro story is going to add up to the bigger picture. At the same time, don't think it's wasteful. I think it's a great sense of character development. It's character development that we don't often see in short stories that authors sometimes don't take the time for. This would be like this sort of side story about Andrew and his, now it connects in a sense to just parents, because more than anything else, the relationship between kids and their parents, or kids and then their own kids, parents and child and parent, usually from the point of view of the middle-aged person, that's going to come up the most in these Munro stories, and just sort of a constant reevaluation of what it means to be a parent, to have a parent, how that changes over time. And in this case, a sort of side story, Andrew is always trying to impress his mom and the aunt and uncle in Ontario who basically help pay for his stuff. Andrew comes from a little bit more money than she does, pardon me. And he wants to impress them. So it's like, he's sending photos back to do that. But again, it's like a room in the house that we're exploring that we don't go to a lot, but still is significant because it's part of the house, right? It's not necessarily, let's say we're going to spend our most time in the den or whatever. That's where this story takes place, the den and the kitchen. But that doesn't mean we can't, look in a bedroom now and then. And she looks very, very, completely, thoroughly. Anyway, so that summer, they're going to drive there. They're not just presenting themselves, they're presenting themselves, not just pictures. So they're going to drive from Vancouver, where they live now, to Ontario, which they called home, new car, and it's like a 5-day trip. So 5 days to get there, 10 days there, 5 days back. On Saturday, they loaded the suitcase. It's a road trip story. Maybe one of my reasons I like this story so much. I love road trip movies. I love road trip stories. Always gives you this potential for something to happen. So they all say goodbye. Meg, the little one, the 3.5-year-old says, "Goodbye, house. Where will we live now?" And Cynthia's like, "It's not goodbye forever." So Andrew and I put on their sunglasses. We drove away. We shut our house, our neighborhood city crossing point between Washington and British Columbia, and they're on the road. They're both in high spirits. They talk about the car a little bit. As for me, now this is great. This is like a classic Munro paragraph. As for me, I was happy because of the shedding. I love taking off. In my own house, I seem to be often looking for a place to hide. Sometimes from the children, but more often from the jobs to be done and the phone ringing and sociability of the neighborhood. I wanted to hide so I could get myself busy. I wanted to hide so that I could get busy at my real work, which is a sort of wooing of distant parts of myself. I lived in a state of siege, always losing just what I wanted to hold on to, but on trips there was no difficulty. I could be talking to Andrew and talking to the children and looking at whatever they wanted me to look at, a pig on a sign, a pony in a field, a Volkswagen on a revolving stand, and pouring lemonade in plastic cups, and all those bits and pieces would be flying together inside of me. The essential composition would be achieved. That hope made me lighthearted. It made me hopeful and lighthearted. It was being a watcher. It was being a watcher that did it. A watcher and not a keeper. Such a powerful paragraph, and really, there's some overlap. I mean, it was sort of more sinister and like had a more edge to it in Revolutionary Road, but an overlap here with her role, April's role. She feels good on a road trip because she doesn't feel sort of bound to the house, bound as a sort of keeper of children, and she's just more sort of they're watching over them. So it's nice. It's sort of a lifting. That's going to come back into play later on, just in sort of what we sign up for when we become parents, whether we like it or not. So anyway, they're driving, they're looking at the atlas. Here are the kids in the back seat. It seems to me now again, this is something that word now that Alice Munro puts in there is something that sort of helps show that this story is like told from a distance. So it's a story where a distant memory sort of plays a role, but it's also a story that itself has some distance between it. Maybe that, I don't know, that is something. I think there are a few stories that seem very immediate, but mostly these Munro stories, maybe that's what they have that some of the others don't, is that sort of that perspective of distance Even though Tim O'Brien was writing, 20 years after the war was over, those war stories were immediate. But here we do get the sense that she's had time to think. Anyway, we invented characters for our children. We had set them firmly to play their parts. There's some overlap there with Revolutionary Road, just sort of roles. Cynthia was bright and diligent, sensitive, courteous, watchful. Meg was more solidly built, more reticent, not rebellious, but stubborn. We were entirely pleased with these characters, enjoying the contradictions as well as the confirmations of them. We disliked the heavy and uninventive approach to being parents. I had a dread of turning into a certain type of mother, the kind whose body sagged, who moved in woolly-smelling, milky fog, solemn with trivial burdens. I believe that all the attention these mothers paid, their need to be burdened, was the cause of colic, bedwetting, and asthma. I favored another approach, the mock desperation, the inflated irony, and lines like, "Is my embryo Hitler by any chance over your house?" They cackled clear above the milky fog. This is really interesting too, just this, and I think it's a generational thing. I know as a parent myself, like considering, like I always think about like how my parents were, and then I know that their parents were different too, and I think there's always sort of a difference there. But you always want to see yourself as, or you try to see yourself as pliable and kind of go with the flow. It's interesting too that to do that sometimes, sadly, we have to sort of create these characters that are our kids, and we don't allow them the room to grow as much as we should out of those roles. And it's hard for me not to see, my kids are 11, my boys are 11 now, my twins, and there's still times when I see them being interested in the things they were interested in when they were 4, which they have very little memory of. Part of that is because of fucking Facebook shoving memories in my face every day. Look what happened 8 years ago, or whatever. But no, it's hard. So like you got it. It's like defining yourself, or it makes it easier on yourself as a parent to kind of do your own thing when they're sort of set, right? And they're locked in. But that's not the case. They're never going to be locked in. They're always going to grow, and just sort of something that this character sort of realizing. Anyway, so we see the dead deer on the pickup truck. Another sort of forewarning. I mean, I this would be in the point of the class where I say, how many of you thought when they went swimming and they didn't find Meg that she was going to die? And like all this stuff had warned me: dead deer, boy who drowned, turkeys, that sort of thing. And that's one thing I can promise you with Munro. She is never going to manipulate you like that. She is not about. John Gardner said the two things. Great writer, actually great writer about writing, and a good friend actually of, or sort of an inspiration of the next writer we're going to look at, Raymond Carver. But John Gardner talked about two of the biggest crimes in fiction are like being too sort of icy about things, like too cold. But also the other one is sentimentality, and that's basically forcing sentiment on a reader, manipulating a reader. You're not going to get that with Munro, and we'll talk about it later. I mean, I think this is a better story. I think this is a more haunting story because the child doesn't die. I think we learn more about some things that are very, very tough to talk about, because if the child had died in this, then the story becomes overwhelmed with a sense of grief. And the narrator would never have been able to give us the clarity that she gives us because the child had almost died. Child didn't even really almost die. Child would have been fine, like what we find out. But I think the perspective she gets from that is different and maybe even more worthwhile than the other's perspective, which would have been, like I said, numbed because she'd had a dead child. So anyway, that's not to say some tragic things won't happen in these Munro stories. I mean, honestly, this is sort of a devastating ending in a way with what she comes up with. But it is to say that she's not going to jerk you around like a Lifetime movie or something like that. Anyway, little tiny fight, sort of under the surface. So like they keep it okay between Andrew and the narrator about the sandwich. Anyway, it doesn't matter that much. There's, oh yeah, then Cynthia starts to sing this damn song about 5 little ducks going out and only 4 little ducks come back. I was like, everything is signaling you, someone's going to die. Anyway, and then again, we explore that den, or we explore that room that we don't really explore a lot in this book. And it's her relationship with Andrew, and she understands that when it comes to him, she has violent contradictions. Sometimes the very sound of his footsteps to me seemed tyrannical. A set of his mouth smug and mean, his hard, straight body a barrier interposed, quite consciously, between me and whatever joy and lightness I can get in life. But then, without much warning, he was my good friend and essential companion. It's this back and forth of marriage in their case. Anyway, we find out in a short little paragraph on my page 382. I haven't seen Andrew for years. Don't know if he's still thin, has gone completely gray. Insists on let us tells the truth, or is hearty and disappointed. So we find out that it didn't work out. But that's not the point of the story. But it's a room we explore. So let's see. Along the way, they stay in Winnetachi. It hadn't rained. That sort of sets up this sort of dryness that's going to be cooled off by that pool later on. Then we get this backstory on her, and we find out that she comes from a farm, a turkey farm. At one point, it was a dairy farm, but apparently they've come upon hard times. There's this image once, shortly before my mother died and after I married. In fact, I was packing to join Andrew in Vancouver. I was at home alone for a couple days with my father. It was a freakishly heavy rainfall night. In early light, we saw the turkey field was flooded. At least the low-lying parts were flooded. It was like a lake with many islands. The turkeys were huddled on these islands. Turkeys are very stupid. You know how stupid a chicken is? Well, the chicken is Einstein compared to a turkey. He's absolutely right. Turkeys are so dumb. Anyway, so she and her father sort of saved these turkeys. And it also shows us that there's like this friction a little bit under the surface in class between the narrator and her husband, and like how he got his money and so forth, and why they try to why Andrew tries to impress them where she comes from. So let's see. So the second night they spend in Missoula. They're driving, and then they start to play a game. They play Who Am I? This is back when you had to play games in a car. You didn't have devices that connected you to outer space. Who am I? Cynthia was somebody dead, an American and a girl, possibly a lady. She was not in a story. She's not been seen on television. She's human. That's why I forgot an animal. And then Meg, the 3.5-year-old, actually guesses it's the deer, the dead deer from yesterday. And Cynthia's kind of mad because she wasn't playing. Nevertheless, they drive on. Meg's getting a little hot. The mom's worried about her being feverish. What are we doing this for? I thought. And the answer came: to show off, to give Andrew's mother and my father the pleasure of seeing their grandchildren. That was our duty. But beyond that, we wanted to show them something. What strenuous children we were, Andrew and I, what relentless seekers of approbation. It was as if at some point we'd received an unforgettable, indigestible message that we were far from satisfactory, and that the most commonplace success in life was probably somewhere beyond us. Roger dealt out messages, of course, that was just out by Andrew's mother. My own mother and father couldn't have meant to do so. All they meant to tell us was, watch out, get along. This connects to this feeling she had, possibly to this feeling she had at the funeral as a little girl, in terms of why they seek this approbation as they grow older and look for this with their parents. Anyway, they see a town, Miles City's coming up, and maybe there'll be a pool there that they can get out in and rest with, which would be great, so they can cool off. And Cynthia's like, oh, there'll be a pool with children, lovely trees, and they get there, and there is a pool and a park. Although it wasn't quite the oasis of Cynthia's fantasy. Prairie trees, worn grass, high wire fence around the pool, which will come in handy later. It's empty. We find out that the pool is closed every day from noon till 2. Nevertheless, I called, is anybody there? I thought somebody must be around because there was a small truck. There's a roto-rooter. I love that the young boyfriend, or the lifeguard's boyfriend, is a roto-rooter man. Girl come out wearing a lifeguard shirt over a bathing suit. Sorry, we're closed. We're just driving through. We close every day from 12 to 2. I saw the sign, but this is the first water we've seen for so long. Children are hot. I wonder if we could just dip in and out. Just 5 minutes we watch it. Also, should point out, this is 1961. This is before air conditioning in cars. So this is something, not serious, but it's something that the kids do need to cool off at this point. Boy comes out. He's got the Roto-Rooter shirt on. Cynthia comes up, running beside, Mother, where's my bathing suit? Then she stops, seeing the serious adult negotiations. Meg climbing out of the car, just waking, her top pulled up and shorts pulled down, showing her pink stomach. Such a great scene that Cynthia, the 6-year-old, runs up, sees her mother, who's probably in her 30s, talking to a lifeguard who's probably 15. And Cynthia, who's 6, sees this conversation between a 15-year-old and her mom, who's 33, 34, as an adult negotiation. That's a great insight from Munro. That's so true. I mean, as a child, it just happens up to a point, and then it changes, I guess, and you sort of realize, you get some perspective. But there's a point where, like, anybody 5 to 6 years older than you is like an adult. As an adult, they're all the same. I remember my first job I had, I was like 10, maybe 9 or 10. My grandpa had a bowling alley, and it was a blast because I got to bowl all the time, and I handed out shoes and candy and shit like that. And like he hired like just some questionable people. They were like young guys, maybe could get in a little bit of trouble here and there, but they were young. They were like probably 18 or 19. And I was always like, my grandpa was like probably 55, 56 at the time. And I always just assumed like outside of when I saw my grandpa, like him and the guys that worked for him were like best friends because they were both old to me. I remember that guy. There was one of them. He was this big guy, like his name was Larry, and he could get me free games at pool, and like he knew all the cheap things on the old arcade version of like Donkey Kong and Pac-Man and Galaga. I learned how to beat all those games just from this guy. So this guy was like a god to me, this Larry. And then I was talking to my uncle, who was he was in Larry's grade in high school, and he's like, "Are you?" I'm talking up to this Larry guy. He's like, "Are you talking about old crazy Larry? He lights his underpants on in shop or something." So anyway, kid's perspective, interesting. Nevertheless, they're able to go to the pool. They talk him into it. The lifeguard says she'll watch, can't let the adults in, so the girls go get changed. I loved helping Meg to dress and undress because her body still had the solid unself consciousness. So the difference between a 3.5-year-old and a 6-year-old, still get that baby fat. So they sit there, windows open. She's getting really like hot, so she moves. Her legs are slick. So she just starts to walk, and she's just looking around as she's walking through the park. And all these details, like she remembers later because of what happens next. But she sees something like a squash leaf, a popsicle stick. This is the way you look at the poorest details in the world after you've resurfaced, after you've been driving a long time. You feel their singleness. And if you've taken a road trip, just stopping. Like everything seems, if you've been on the road, say 3-4 hours nonstop, and you stop anywhere, stop at a truck stop, everything just sort of comes to life. But then something hits her. Where are the children? She turned, moved quickly, not quite running. She's not quite panicked yet. And she sees Cynthia. And Cynthia is looking at something else. And we find out that she's looking at, she's ended up looking at the lifeguard and her boyfriend are probably kissing or whatever. Then she can't see Meg. But the shallow and the deep ends of the pool were out of my sight. Cynthia, where's Meg? It always seems to me when I recall this scene that Cynthia turns very gracefully towards me, then turns around in the water like a ballerina and spreads her arms, disappeared. Cynthia was naturally graceful. She did take dancing lessons, but it probably didn't happen quite that way. And again, that's memory, that's happening truth for story truth. Anyway, can't see it. She cries out for Andrew. Lifeguard comes into view. And then she points, what's that? There, just within my view, a cluster of pink ruffles appeared, bouquet, beneath the surface of the water. So we see the top of the bathing suit, or the part of the bathing suit. And she sees Andrew, and she feels like Andrew jumps over the fence, which was like 7 feet high. I mean, I don't know, you never know what really happens, but he probably didn't jump over the fence all at one time. But he gets there, the drama is over, she's fine. She wasn't even drowning, she was actually swimming. She was an accident, she'd fallen into the water looking for something and thinking it was the shallow end, and had fallen in and then swam. So she didn't know, I mean, it's like one of those, like, you ever use that expression, oh, I had a near-death experience, but it wasn't really a near-death experience. It was just something that could have been, had the situation been different, but that's sort of like life. But nevertheless, scary nonetheless. So drama was over. Andrew got to Meg first, pulled her out of the water. He had to reach her because she was swimming somehow with her head underwater. She was carrying her, and the lifeguard was trotting along behind. Love that the lifeguard runs out, points, instead of just diving into the water. The only person aloof from the situation was the boyfriend who had stayed on the bench at the shallow end drinking a milkshake. He smiled. And then I love that he doesn't even turn the radio off. He just turns it down. I don't know if I tell it. This will be a repeated story if I had. This reminds me that the lifeguard, sort of her reaction, as like sort of shaken a little bit, as you would be. I don't know if I told you the time I got hit by a car while I was jogging. If I've told you this story, you can just fast forward or whatever. But this was like 15, maybe even longer than that, years ago. And it was back when I lived in Missouri, and I was jogging, as I do a lot, and I was running through a high school parking lot, and the parking lot had like a circle drive, sidewalk all the way through it, and I'm jogging. The next thing I know, I'm on the ground, and my first thought is I ran into a parked car. I'm an idiot, and I hop up as fast as I can because I'm embarrassed. Knee is bleeding, like shoulder's a little scratched, my back hurts, and I'm just embarrassed. And I turn, I look, and the car that thought I ran into is not parked. It's like in the middle of and it's like running. And behind the wheel, there's this young student, this girl, and she's going scared to death, crying. So she gets out of the car, crying, and finally I have to calm her down. I was like, yeah, I'm like, you're gonna be okay. And like, I got blood all over me and everything. And then behind the car is like a car maybe with her friends in it, and they're just sitting there like this, all worried. So finally, after she catches her breath, she's like, let me drive you. I'll drive you to the hospital. And I'm like, you're not fucking driving me anywhere. So I was gonna take my chances running. But anyway, it reminds me of that. Anyway, I was getting the comb. I didn't know it was so deep. So there's a comb in the water. This is one of those just dark mysteries of life. The whole we'll never know why something happened, which is just something we've heard. We hear a lot sometimes. Sadly, this way it goes. We never know why this. Here we get our answer because something bad doesn't happen. And had she drowned, there's no way that they ever would have assumed, oh, she was going after this comb that was on the bottom. No, I mean, you wouldn't have known. You wouldn't have known anything. And that whole why, that would have existed there, like that abstract feeling. Not quite the same, obviously, but still like sort of abstract grief that Shoba had to deal with, not knowing what the baby looked like, or the gender of the baby in a temporary matter. It would have just been this thing that'd be really hard. I mean, it's hard. Death's obviously hard to deal with in any circumstance, but the not knowing, it also sort of reminds me of like finding out about Kiwa's family, finding out about his death. We had that conversation in class, like, how much do you want to know? I think I want to know all of it. I don't think I would want anything left to the abstract. In this case, they wouldn't have known. I don't know what could have happened, said the lifeguard. One moment she was there, next moment she wasn't. What happened was that Megan climbed out of the water in the shallow end and ran, and then she didn't realize she was in the deep end. So she goes to the edge, she falls in, nobody hears her splash. At the moment, Meg was slipping, surprised, into treacherously clear blue water. Now, that's going to be a line that comes back here in a minute. Just remember, though, clear blue water. I mean, it's a pool. It's a pool that's, it's chlorine, it's clean, it's clear, you can see through it. But that word treacherously, right in front of it, very interesting. I didn't know it was deep. I didn't drown. They had lunch at a takeout place. The narrator's still so shaken that she forgets to order make a plain hamburger. She has to scrape off the relish and mustard with plastic spoons, wipe the meat with a paper napkin. That's a great touch. Andrew and I talked quietly about what happened. Suppose I hadn't had the impulse to check on the children. Suppose we had gone uptown to get drinks. Had thought that they'd actually thought about that. They thought, why don't we go get drinks? How did he get over the fence so fast? Disappeared. But she swam, she held her breath, came up swimming. What a chain of lucky links. That was all we spoke about luck. But I was compelled to picture the opposite. Sort of, this is tough. At this moment, we could have been filling out forms. Meg removed from us, Meg's body being prepared for shipment to Vancouver, where we had never noticed such a thing as a graveyard, or to Ontario. The scribbled drawing she had made this morning would still be in the back seat of the car. Now, I'll posit to you that had the story been written to where she does die, and then we see those drawings, it's a cheap move. It's a cheap move because we're not given the opportunity to explore anything beyond, oh my God, this kid's dead, and I'm sad about it. Here we're exploring sort of bigger consequences and bigger, more philosophical ideas because she's not dead. At the same time, just the thought is heartbreaking. So we don't need to be goosed any more than that. How do people bear it? The most ordinary tragedy. A child drowned in a swimming pool at noon on a sunny day. Things tidied up. Pool opens as usual. Lifeguard goes home. Body sealed. Sedatives, phone calls, arrangements. Such a sudden vacancy, a blinding and shifting, waking up groggy from pills, thinking for a moment it's not true, and then realizing it is, thinking if only we hadn't stopped, if only we hadn't taken this route, if only they hadn't let us use the pool, probably no one would have even known about the comb. There's something trashy about this kind of imagining, isn't there? Something shameful. Laying your finger on the wire just to get that safe shock, feeling a bit what it's like, then pulling back. There is. I love that admission because it is a trashy way of thinking, because, if it doesn't happen to you, it should be enough just to feel lucky. You shouldn't have to, touch that wire just to get that jolt. It feels something, it feels shook, but I think it's human to do that. I believe that Andrew's more scrupulous about such things. In this moment, he's really trying to think about something else. But she can't be. She has to dig in. And so she connects it. And in such a beautiful, powerful way. When I stood apart from my parents at Steve Gawley's funeral and watched them, I had this new unpleasant feeling about them. I thought that I was understanding something about them for the first time. It was a deadly, serious thing. I was understanding they were implicated. Their big, stiff, dressed-up bodies did not stand between me and sudden death or any kind of death. Now she can articulate this feeling. They gave consent, so it seemed. They gave consent to the death of children and to my death, not by anything they said or thought, but by the very fact they had made children. They had made me. That is a hard line to listen to. It's a hard line to hear, but it's true. So I'm careful about who's around as I say this. The one thing that you have guaranteed when you have a child is that someday that child will not be around. Now, we all hope it's, when they're 80 or 90 and I'm 120 and I'll be sad at 120. But no, that's what you hope. But, you're not guaranteed anything. They had made me, for that reason, my death, however grieved they were, was anything but impossible or unnatural. It was a fact. It was the one fact there was. So, in a way, they were not to blame. But that's not why she's mad at them, or the adults in general in that room that day with Steve Gawley. I charged them with effrontery, hypocrisy on Steve Gawley's behalf and on behalf of all children who knew by rights they should have been strong, free to live a new superior kind of life, to be caught in the snares of ungrateful grown-ups. Steve Gawley drowned, people said, because he was the next thing to an orphan and was let run free. If he had been warned enough and given chores to do and kept in check, he wouldn't have fallen from an untrusted tree branch in the spring pond. These people comforted themselves by the fact that there was an aberration. Steve didn't have a good home. Steve didn't have a mom at home. Steve's dad didn't care about him. That's why Steve died. Even if they're not meaning to, it's a trashy way of looking at it. And it's a way of looking at it, though, that we do maybe to comfort ourselves, that if we do things just right, we can prevent these things. I can control time. It's the clock all over again. I can control time. I can make sure. And they're like, he drowned because if he'd only had somebody there to say, don't get on that tree, don't climb on that tree. His father took it, he was neglected, he was free. He didn't have a good suit his father took it as an accident such as might happen to a dog. So like on the surface, you're like, well, the dad just is sort of an awful character. But she lets the dad off the hook because the dad's not bullshitting around. He's saying things happen. Now, he may not care for his son as much as we'd like, but he's being honest about the realities. The people in this town aren't. The people in this town are saying this only happens to kids who aren't watched out for, which is fucking bullshit. And the story itself tells us that, because where was that child of hers going to drown? A child that's very well taken care of, that has two good parents. They're on a trip together. Parents have actually stopped for her well-being because she's hot. They've gone to a pool with a lifeguard, with a shallow end, with clear blue water, not the mud that killed Steve Gawley. And still, she could have died. And what would you say that? I mean, maybe we, in our ways that we do this sometimes, maybe we, ration out some reason for it too, and say, well, if the parents would, they took their eyes out, that sort of thing. And the world's just not made like that. But she, for this reason, I love this. He didn't have a good suit for the funeral, Steve's dad, and he didn't bow his head for the prayers. But he was the only grown-up I let off the hook. He was the only one I didn't see giving consent. He couldn't prevent anything, but he wasn't implicated in anything either. Not like the others, saying the Lord's Prayer, their unnaturally weighted voices, oozing religion and dishonor. Hypocrites for the way they looked at why Steve Gawley died. To comfort themselves, really. At Glendive, not far from North Dakota border, had a choice. They decided they cut back on Highway 2. Like the idea better. It's a plan from the beginning. We missed seeing Kyle and Harv, Wolf Point. I like the name. We'll see him on the way back. Saying on the way back was a surprising pleasure to me, because it means there's a way back. Like it's not, this trip's not going to be interrupted with death and this sort of sadness, and it makes us feel like we're in control. It was a relief to hear him say it. What I can't get over, Andrew says, how you got that signal. It's got to be some type of extra sense mothers have. No. Partly I wanted to believe him, to bask in my extra sense, but partly because she's a great narrator, a great classic, thoughtful Alice Munro narrator. Partly I wanted to warn him, to warn everybody, don't ever count on it. Even if the water's clear and blue, or the water's dark and muddy, and one kid has parents to look after him, one kid doesn't, you never know what's going to happen. What I can't understand is how you got over the fence. Neither can I. So we went on, the two in the back seat trusting us because of no choice, we ourselves turning to be forgiven in time for everything that had to be seen and condemned by those children, whatever was flippant, arbitrary, careless, callous, all our natural and particular mistakes. Man, just under 50 minutes. That's Miles City, Montana. Hope you like. I'm not going to give you any specific questions for this one. I may put down a few on the message board and just reply best you can. If you can just title your reply. No, I can't. I still haven't figured out. And I've asked 5 different people who've told me 5 different things, and they say they struggle with it too. So it's no biggie. If you could title, like many of you are doing, title your post. Again, post 1 original, 2 responses to the various ones. And I'd just like to hear what your thoughts were on this story, because I know there's a lot of points I didn't touch on. But anything I talked about, you can bring up. Anything we missed. And if I missed something and you had a direct question about it, I read them all, so I do my best to reply when sort of necessary. But I also like to give you guys some room to work there as well. So I'll see you tomorrow with The Progress of Love, which is certainly a story that will take you back to the whole happening truth versus story truth. It may be one of the best examples of that I've ever seen in literature. But all right, have a good one.